Your kitchen counter is not cluttered because you cook a lot or because your kitchen is small. It is cluttered because of a single rule you were never taught, a rule that nearly every Japanese kitchen follows without anyone ever stating it out loud, and one I had genuinely never heard of until I started researching this video. I tested it for 3 weeks in my own kitchen, expecting it to be impossible to maintain, and instead found the opposite, a counter that stayed clear with less daily effort than my old, cluttered counter ever required. Stay with me until the third principle, because that is the one that completely changed how I think about what a counter is even for. Let's start with the rule itself. In Japanese kitchen culture, there is a working principle sometimes summarized as dashipanashi wa shiranai, the avoidance of leaving things out, and it operates on a standard that initially sounds almost unreasonable to a Western home cook. Nothing lives permanently on the counter unless it is used at minimum once a day, every single day, without exception. Not the blender used twice a week. Not the fruit bowl that holds fruit some weeks and dust the others. Not the cutting board that sits out because it might be needed later. The standard is daily use or it goes away, and the first time I read this rule, I assumed my counter would fail it almost completely. It did. 23 separate items lived on my counters before I started this experiment, and by the strict daily use standard, only 4 of them qualified to stay. Before I explain what I removed, I want to explain why this rule exists at all, because it is not really about cleanliness, the same way the bathroom sink habit I have talked about before is not really about cleanliness either. Japanese kitchen counters are typically smaller than Western counters, sometimes dramatically so, and small spaces force a question that large counters let you avoid asking: what does the surface actually need to do? A counter's primary function is to provide open, immediately usable space for food preparation. Every object that sits on it permanently is not neutral, it is actively consuming a portion of that function, whether or not it looks tidy. Architects and kitchen designers studying small Japanese apartments have noted that this forces a kind of functional honesty that larger Western kitchens rarely require, because there is no spare counter to hide an unnecessary toaster on. I had spare counter. I had used it to hide 19 unnecessary objects, and the rule asked me to stop. The first principle, and the easiest to apply immediately, is what I'll call the daily test, applied honestly. For 3 days before changing anything, I simply observed which items on my counter I actually touched, not which ones I assumed I used often, but which ones I physically picked up. My coffee maker, used every single morning, passed. My knife block, used daily, passed. A stand mixer, used roughly twice a month, failed, despite feeling like a kitchen essential because of how much counter space it occupied and how visually prominent it was. A fruit bowl, used inconsistently, failed. A decorative cutting board I had never once actually cut anything on, kept purely for how it looked leaning against the backsplash, failed in the most obvious way possible. The daily test is uncomfortable specifically because it separates what you use from what you simply look at, and most Western kitchen counters, mine included, had quietly become more of the second category than the first. The second principle is what Japanese kitchen organization calls Shimau Basho, literally the place where it goes away, the requirement that every item removed from the counter has an immediate, specific, already existing storage location, not a vague intention to find one eventually. This is where most decluttering attempts fail, in any room, not just the kitchen, because removing an object from a visible surface without a real destination for it just relocates the clutter rather than resolving it. Before I moved a single item off my counter, I identified exactly where each one would live: the stand mixer in the lower cabinet I had been using for serving platters I rarely used, the fruit bowl's contents moved into the refrigerator's produce drawer where fruit actually stays fresher anyway, the decorative cutting board given away entirely because it genuinely had no function beyond decoration. This step took longer than the physical removal, nearly 2 hours of figuring out destinations, but it is the reason the counter has stayed clear for 3 weeks rather than refilling within days the way my previous decluttering attempts always had. The third principle is the one I told you would change how I think about counters entirely, and it is called Tatazumai, a word that describes the overall presence or bearing of a space, the impression it gives at a glance before you've consciously analyzed anything in it. Japanese kitchen design treats the counter's Tatazumai as something with real value on its own, independent of function, the way a clear horizon line has value independent of any single thing within it. A Western kitchen counter is generally evaluated object by object: is this useful? Does this have a place here? A Japanese kitchen counter is evaluated as a whole first: what does this entire surface communicate at a glance? And individual objects earn their place partly based on whether they preserve or damage that overall impression, not just whether they are independently useful. This reframes the empty space itself as something the counter is providing, not something missing from it. My coffee maker and knife block, both genuinely used daily, still nearly got removed during this process, because even though each passed the daily test individually, having both prominent and visible together changed the counter's Tatazumai in a way that felt cluttered despite both items being functionally justified. I ended up tucking the coffee maker into a shallow alcove to one side, keeping it just as accessible but out of the immediate sightline from the kitchen entrance, and the difference in how the whole room felt was larger than I expected from such a small adjustment. Here's what 3 weeks produced, measured as honestly as I could manage. My counter went from 23 permanent items to 4, the coffee maker, the knife block, a single utensil crock, and a small dish soap dispenser, all 4 used multiple times daily without exception. The visible surface area of usable counter space increased by roughly 70%, which I measured with painter's tape before and after, mostly because I did not believe my own eyes the first time I looked at the empty space and wanted a number to check the impression against. But the more interesting result was not the square footage, it was the maintenance time. My old, cluttered counter took an average of 6 minutes to clean and reset each evening, because every object had to be lifted, wiped under, and replaced individually. My new counter, with almost nothing permanently on it, takes 90 seconds, because there is almost nothing to navigate around. Princeton's research on visual clutter and cognitive load, the same research that explains why an unwiped sink quietly taxes attention throughout the day, applies here at a larger scale. A counter with 19 fewer objects in the field of view is a counter that stops asking for small amounts of background attention every time you walk into the kitchen, whether or not you are actively using it. I also want to mention the part of this experiment that genuinely surprised me, which is how little I missed the items I removed. I expected at least a few moments of frustration, reaching for the stand mixer and feeling annoyed it was now in a cabinet instead of ready on the counter. It happened exactly twice in 3 weeks, and both times the actual retrieval took under 10 seconds, a cost so small it did not come close to offsetting the daily benefit of not navigating around it for the other 20 days I did not use it. The Western instinct toward counter convenience optimizes for the rare moment of use at the cost of constant, low-grade obstruction during all the much more frequent moments of non-use, and once I saw that trade laid out honestly, item by item, the decision to put things away stopped feeling like a sacrifice. There is a reason this rule produces zero clutter specifically, rather than just less clutter, and I think it comes down to the standard being binary rather than gradual. Most Western decluttering advice operates on a spectrum: reduce what you can, simplify where possible, which leaves enormous room for judgment calls that tend to favor keeping things. The Japanese daily use standard is a clean binary, use today or not, which removes the negotiation entirely. There is no judgment call to make about the stand mixer once the rule is simply does it get touched today, because the answer on most days is no, and the rule does not ask for an exception. So here is everything in one breath. Nothing earns permanent counter space unless it is genuinely used at least once a day, tested honestly rather than assumed. Every item removed needs a real, already existing place to go, not a vague intention to find one later. And the counter as a whole is evaluated for its overall impression, its Tatazumai, not just object by object, which sometimes means relocating even a daily use item if its visibility is working against the calm of the whole room. Now I want to hear from you. Walk into your kitchen and count how many items on your counter you have genuinely touched today, not this week, today. Tell me the number in the comments. If it's under 5, you are already closer to a Japanese kitchen counter than you think. If it's over 15, like mine was, you already know exactly where your cleaning time has been going. And if this made you think of someone whose counter you have quietly judged every time you visited their kitchen, send them this video instead of the comment you've been holding back. They might be one honest afternoon away from a counter that finally gives them back the space it was always supposed to provide. This is Tokyo Horizon. I will see you in the next one.